Margaret Sullivan spent 43 years teaching literature, priding herself on remembering every student's name until early-onset Alzheimer's stole her words, her memories, and her will to live. The cruel disease became her silent enemy, convincing her she had no value left, pushing her into despair darker than any symptom. But her daughter Emma discovered an old family remedy, apple and cinnamon tea, that her grandmother swore sharpened the mind. And what happened next defied even her neurologist's skepticism. Just listen to how this simple tradition turned Margaret's fate around, proving that sometimes hope and ancestral wisdom triumph where modern medicine falls short. Margaret Sullivan's classroom at Lincoln High had been her kingdom for 43 years. Room 2U4, third floor, where sunlight streamed through tall windows each morning and illuminated rows of expectant faces. She knew every student who passed through those doors. Tommy Richardson, who struggled with Shakespeare but wrote beautiful personal essays. Sarah Chen, whose analysis of Emily Dickinson made Margaret's heart soar. Marcus Williams, who came in angry and left loving poetry. She remembered them all, their dreams, their fears, their breakthrough moments. Margaret could recall the exact inflection in Jessica Moore's voice when she finally understood Robert Frost's metaphor. She remembered how Daniel Foster's hands shook when he read his first poem aloud, and how the class erupted in applause. Memory wasn't just her profession. It was her superpower, her gift, the foundation of everything she was. That's why the first slip terrified her so completely. It happened during fourth period on a Wednesday in September. Margaret stood at the front of the class, mid-sentence about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, and the word vanished. Not forgotten, but gone, as if someone had plucked it from her brain. The green light represents. She fumbled, reaching for something that should have been right there. It represents. Hope, offered Katie Morrison from the second row. Yes, hope, Margaret continued, but her hands trembled as she wrote it on the board. That had never happened before, not once in 4 decades. The incidents multiplied like cracks in glass. She'd walk into a room and forget why, stand in the grocery store unable to remember what she needed, call her daughter Emma by her sister's name. The words that had been her closest companions began slipping away like water through her fingers. In October, she forgot Michael Patterson's name. Sweet Michael, who sat in the front row and participated in every discussion. She'd taught his older brother 5 years ago, met his parents a dozen times. But when he raised his hand to answer a question, she looked at him and drew complete blankness. Yes, you, she said, pointing, and saw the hurt flicker across his face. After class, she sat at her desk and wept. This wasn't normal aging. This was something terrifying. The neurologist's office smelled of antiseptic and artificial lemon. Dr. Patricia Chen was younger than Margaret expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She asked questions while making notes. Can you remember 3 words I tell you? Can you draw a clock? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? Margaret failed. She knew she failed by the careful neutrality in Dr. Chen's expression. The test came next. MRI scans, cognitive assessments, blood work, more questions, more failures. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Margaret sat across from Dr. Chen in an office decorated with certificates and family photos. The world outside looked normal, but Margaret knew nothing would ever be the same. I'm very sorry, Margaret, Dr. Chen began. The scans and tests indicate early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret's vision narrowed, her breathing shallow. Alzheimer's. The disease that had taken her colleague Ruth 3 years ago, turning a brilliant history teacher into someone who didn't recognize her own children. How long? Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. The progression varies. We can try medications that may slow the advance, but there's no cure. I'm truly sorry. Margaret clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white. Teaching was everything to her. It wasn't what she did. It was who she was. Without her memory, without her mind, she was nothing. She drove home in a daze, barely registering the familiar streets. Her small house on Maple Street felt like a stranger's home. She looked at photos on the walls. Emma at graduation, Emma's wedding, Emma holding newborn Grace. How long until those memories dissolved? How long until she looked at those photos and saw strangers? 3 days passed in fog. Margaret called in sick to school, something she'd done maybe 5 times in 43 years. She couldn't face her students, couldn't bear the thought of losing words in front of them. On Friday afternoon, she decided to bake. Her famous apple pie, the one she'd made for every family gathering, every school potluck. She'd made it hundreds of times. Surely muscle memory would carry her through. She pulled out her mother's old cookbooks, spreading them across the kitchen table. The pages were stained and worn, annotations in the margins, in her mother's handwriting. Margaret stared at the apple pie recipe, and it might as well have been written in a foreign language. 2 cups of flour? Or was it 3? How much butter? She knew this recipe. She'd made it blindfolded once. But now, sitting with fresh apples from the farmer's market, she couldn't remember. The tears came then, hot and bitter. She pushed the cookbooks away and put her head down on the table, sobbing. She couldn't remember how to make a pie. What would go next? How to drive? How to dress herself? How to recognize her own daughter? That's where Emma found her 20 minutes later. Margaret had given Emma a key years ago, and now her daughter let herself in, calling out cheerfully, "Mom, I brought lunch from that Thai place you love." Emma stopped in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene. Her mother hunched over the table, surrounded by cookbooks and browning apples, tears streaming down her face. "Mom?" Emma dropped the takeout bag and rushed over, kneeling beside Margaret's chair. "What's wrong?" Margaret couldn't speak. She gestured helplessly at the cookbooks, at the apples, at the empty pie pan on the counter. Emma understood immediately. She wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her while Margaret cried. They'd always been close, especially after Margaret's husband died 8 years ago. Emma was her only child, her best friend, her everything. "Mom, it's okay," Emma whispered, stroking her mother's hair. "It's not okay." Margaret's voice cracked, raw with pain. "I can't remember how to make a pie." "A pie, Emma? I've made it 1,000 times. If I can't remember that, what's next?" She pulled back, looking at her daughter through tears. "How long before I forget your name? Before I forget I even had a daughter? Before I look at you and see a stranger?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, don't say that. It's true. You know it's true." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Dr. Chen said there's no cure. I'm going to lose everything. Everyone, including you." They sat together in the kitchen as afternoon light faded to evening. Emma ordered pizza, neither of them ate. The future stretched before them, dark and inevitable. The weeks that followed felt like drowning in slow motion. Dr. Chen prescribed medications with long chemical names. Margaret took them faithfully, even though they made her nauseous and dizzy. She did cognitive puzzles that frustrated her to tears. She attended a support group at the hospital, sitting in a circle with 10 other people in various stages of decline. The support group was the worst. Margaret looked around that circle and saw her future. Harold, who kept asking the same questions every 5 minutes. Susan, who stared vacantly and barely spoke. James, who broke down crying because he couldn't remember his grandson's birthday. After 3 sessions, Margaret stopped going. What was the point? Better to stay home. Better to be alone. She stopped calling her friends from the book club she'd attended for 15 years. Stopped going to the community theater where she'd volunteered. Stopped attending church on Sundays. She avoided anyone who knew her as the woman she'd been. Reading, her lifelong passion, became torture. She'd get halfway through a chapter and forget what happened at the beginning. Characters blurred together. Plots made no sense. She abandoned book after book until finally she stopped trying altogether. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, became enemy territory. Every time she looked at her cooking tools, she remembered the apple pie incident. The humiliation, the loss, the proof that she was broken. She stopped cooking. Emma brought meals. Margaret barely tasted them. Emma visited every day now, her worry apparent in every glance, every careful question. "How are you feeling, Mom? Did you take your medicine?" Margaret gave vague answers, avoided eye contact, and waited for her daughter to leave so she could return to the television. She wasn't watching the shows. They flickered past in a meaningless blur. But sitting in front of the TV was easier than thinking, easier than remembering what she'd lost, easier than facing the terrifying void her life had become. Margaret Sullivan, who'd spent 43 years shaping young minds and celebrating the power of memory, had given up. Not on the disease, but on life itself. Better to retreat, to withdraw, to wait for the inevitable in quiet darkness. Emma saw it happening and felt helpless to stop it. Her vibrant, brilliant mother was fading away, not from Alzheimer's, but from despair. On a cold afternoon in January, Emma sat in her car outside her mother's house, gathering courage. She'd spent the past week researching, reading medical journals and alternative treatments. Most of it was nonsense, desperate snake oil. But one thing kept appearing in her searches, something her grandmother Rose had done every single morning of her long life. Emma pulled the small cloth bag from her passenger seat. Inside were 3 cinnamon sticks and 4 fresh Honeycrisp apples, her grandmother's favorites. She remembered sitting in Grandma Rose's kitchen as a child, watching those wrinkled hands slice apples with practiced ease, adding cinnamon and honey to the pot. "This keeps the mind sharp," Grandma Rose would say, tapping her temple with a knowing smile. Grandma Rose had lived to 96, sharp as a tack until the end. She died peacefully in her sleep, still able to quote poetry and remember the names of all 12 great-grandchildren. Emma had always assumed it was good genetics, but maybe there'd been something more to that daily ritual. She found her mother in the living room, staring at a game show with vacant eyes. Margaret barely acknowledged her daughter's entrance, just a slight nod. "Mom, I want to try something," Emma said, sitting on the coffee table directly in Margaret's line of sight. Margaret's eyes focused on her daughter with effort. "Another miracle cure?" Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. "No, just something Grandma used to do." Emma pulled the apples and cinnamon from the cloth bag. "Remember when Grandma Rose would make us that apple cinnamon tea every time we visited?" She always said it sharpened her mind. For the first time in weeks, something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Recognition, memory. "Your grandmother made that every morning." Her voice softened. "She lived to 96 and never forgot a thing. She could recite Shakespeare on her deathbed." "Let's make it together," Emma said softly, standing and extending her hand. Margaret looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment. Part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat back into the safe numbness. What was the point? 1 cup of spiced tea wouldn't change anything. But then Emma pulled out a cinnamon stick and held it under Margaret's nose. The scent hit her like a wave, rich and warm and impossibly familiar. Suddenly she was 7 years old again, standing in her mother's kitchen, watching Grandma Rose move around with confident grace. The morning sun through yellow curtains, the sound of her mother humming, the feeling of being completely, perfectly safe. Almost against her will, Margaret found herself standing, following Emma to the kitchen. Her daughter moved with purpose, pulling out a small pot, filling it with water, setting it on the stove. Emma washed an apple and handed Margaret the paring knife. Margaret held the knife, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't remember how—" "I'll show you," Emma interrupted gently, "just like Grandma showed us." Together they sliced the apple. Emma's hands guided her mother's when they shook. They dropped the slices into the simmering water, added the cinnamon stick, stirred in a teaspoon of honey. The kitchen filled with that same scent from Margaret's childhood, warming and familiar and inexplicably comforting. They made it in silence, both lost in their own memories. When the tea was ready, Emma poured it into 2 mugs. Margaret wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling deeply before taking a slow sip. The warm spice coated her throat, sweet and slightly sharp. "How do you feel?" Emma asked after a moment. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth spread through her chest. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced with crystalline clarity. "I remember Grandma Rose's hands," Margaret said softly, opening her eyes. "How they looked cutting the apples. She wore that gold wedding band that was too big, and it would spin around her finger. She had a scar on her right thumb from a canning accident." She paused, surprised by the vividness of the memory. "I haven't thought about that in years. Decades, maybe." Emma smiled, genuine hope lighting her face for the first time in months. "Drink this every morning, Mom. Let's see what happens." Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't believe in miracles. The rational part of her brain knew that Alzheimer's didn't respond to folk remedies. But sitting in her kitchen, holding this warm mug, remembering her grandmother's hands with perfect clarity, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Something smaller, more fragile. The willingness to try. The acceptance that even if this changed nothing, at least she'd done something. At least she hadn't given up completely. The next morning, Margaret woke early. Before the despair could settle over her, she went to the kitchen. She sliced an apple, added cinnamon and honey, made the tea exactly as Emma had shown her. It became a ritual, a small act of defiance against the disease stealing her life piece by piece. She didn't expect miracles. She didn't let herself hope for a cure. She just needed something to hold on to, something that connected her to her mother, her grandmother, the long line of strong women who'd come before her. A reminder that she was still Margaret Sullivan, even diminished, still someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who mattered. Every morning she made her apple cinnamon tea, and every morning she fought back the darkness just a little bit longer. After 2 weeks of the morning ritual, Margaret woke up feeling different. The fog that had settled over her mind seemed thinner. She sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper and realized she was actually following the article. The sentences connected. The arguments made sense. She reached the end and could remember what the beginning had said. Small things, but they felt monumental. She could finish her sentences without grasping for words. She remembered what she'd eaten for breakfast. She watched a TV show and recalled the plot when the next episode came on. At her next appointment, Dr. Chen listened to Margaret's excited report with careful neutrality. "I feel sharper," Margaret said. "The fog is thinner. I can read again. I can remember conversations." "Memory can be very subjective, Margaret," Dr. Chen said gently. "Sometimes patients have good days and bad days. Sometimes the desire to feel better can create a perception of improvement. Don't get your hopes too high." But Margaret knew. She felt sharper, more present. She wasn't imagining it. She went home and called her friend Patricia, who she hadn't spoken to in months. They talked for 40 minutes. When they hung up, Margaret realized she could remember everything Patricia had said, every detail about her grandson's soccer tournament, every complaint about the theater production. She started reading again. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, a book she'd abandoned months ago. She read for 3 hours straight, following the plot, remembering the characters, understanding the magical world. When she set the book down, tears streamed down her face. Emma researched obsessively and found studies about cinnamon's effect on cognitive function, about apple's quercetin protecting brain cells. "The combination Grandma Rose used has actual scientific backing," Emma told her mother, scrolling through research papers on her phone. "It's not a cure, but it does seem to slow cognitive decline in some people. It's buying you time." Time. That's all Margaret had wanted. Just time to be herself a little longer, to remember her daughter's face, to read books and exist as Margaret Sullivan instead of a disease. 3 months later, Margaret walked into the Riverside Public Library and asked about volunteering for the literacy program. "I was a high school literature teacher for 43 years, she said. "I'd like to help. Just one afternoon a week." She was terrified she'd fail. What if she forgot a student's name? What if she lost her place in a lesson? But when she walked into the small room where 3 adults waited nervously, something clicked into place. She met Carlos, learning to read so he could help his grandchildren. Jennifer, who'd hidden her illiteracy her entire adult life. Robert, determined to finally read his father's war letters. Margaret worked with them for 2 hours. She remembered all 3 names. She kept her place in the lessons. She was patient and encouraging and competent. The apple cinnamon ritual had given her back enough of herself to function, to contribute, to matter again. She wasn't the teacher she'd been, but she was someone. That was enough. One evening, as she prepared her nightly cup of the mixture, Emma found her in the kitchen crying again. But these were different tears. "Mom? I thought my life was over," Margaret said, stirring the cinnamon into the simmering apple water. "I thought I had nothing left but waiting to disappear." She turned to face her daughter. "This didn't cure me, I know that. I still have bad days. I still forget things. Yesterday I couldn't remember the word for spatula. This morning I called you Rachel." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But it gave me back enough of myself to remember why life matters. To remember that even diminished, even imperfect, I still have value. I can still read. I can still help Carlos learn his letters. I can still tell you I love you and know exactly what those words mean." Emma hugged her tightly. "You always had value, Mom." "I know that now," Margaret whispered. "I lost hope, and that was worse than losing my memory. This simple thing, this tradition from your grandmother, it didn't just help my brain. It reminded me that even small actions matter, that giving up is the real tragedy." Margaret returned to the support group she'd abandoned. This time she brought her apple cinnamon mixture in a thermos to share. She told her story not as a miracle cure, but as a testament to hope, to trying, to refusing to surrender. "I'm not saying this will work for everyone," she said, pouring tea for the group members, "but it helped me. The research says cinnamon and apples can support cognitive function. I feel better, sharper, more present. I can read again. I'm volunteering again. I'm living again." Some scoffed. Harold dismissed it as placebo effect, but others were interested. Jennifer tried it and came back 3 weeks later saying she'd remembered her grandson's birthday for the first time in 6 months. Robert said the fog felt lighter. Not everyone, and not dramatically, but enough to matter. Enough to give them reasons to keep fighting. Margaret's disease would progress eventually. She knew that. The tea wasn't stopping Alzheimer's, just slowing it down, buying her precious time. But she'd reclaimed her present, and that changed everything. She started writing in a journal Emma had given her, writing down her memories, her lessons learned over 43 years of teaching, her love for her daughter and grandchildren. Words that might outlast her fading mind. Stories she wanted preserved when she could no longer remember them herself. On her 65th birthday, Emma gave her a special journal filled with blank pages titled Life Recipes. Not just food recipes, Emma explained, but lessons on resilience, hope, and the power of simple rituals. You taught me that sometimes the answer to life's cruelest challenges isn't found in medicine or science, but in the wisdom of those who came before, in the courage to keep trying, in understanding that every clear moment, every preserved memory, every day of presence is a victory worth celebrating. Margaret held the journal, tears in her eyes. She taught her daughter one final lesson without even realizing it. She still made her apple cinnamon mixture every morning. It had become more than a treatment. It was a promise to herself that she wouldn't let despair win, that she'd fight for every lucid day, every remembered moment, every chance to tell the people she loved exactly how much they meant to her. The fog would eventually win. The disease would progress. But not today. Today, Margaret Sullivan was present, aware, and grateful. Today, she could read and teach and love and remember. And that made today a victory.